Welcome everyone to another episode of Kiwi Talks. My guest today is an award-winning writer. He's probably best known for his tenure at Telltale. He's worked on prestigious IP like Batman, Minecraft, The Walking Dead, Game of Thrones. I'm going to stop there before we go and get a Guinness World Record for the longest introduction ever. I'd like to welcome Ryan Kaufman. How you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm really glad to be here.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's good to meet you and great to be here. So,
thanks for taking
yeah.
time out. I thought I'd switch this up for you so I don't give you like the generic opening question like, how did you get into the games industry? I actually want to know. So, because you've said before that if you could make your dream game, it would be a narrative version of Titanic, right?
Oh,
So,
yeah.
yeah. So, why is that?
Um, I'm fascinated by the situations that have like a hopeless ending, but there are stories within that that have hope or that have some kind of amazing outcome. You know, that everyone who survived the Titanic to me is sort of a miraculous um story in and of itself. And anyone who didn't is an amazingly tragic and also interesting story. So I've just been fascinated with Titanic for a really long time, but like there's something about the contained space of like it's going to happen over 3 hours or 3 days or however long you want to be on that boat, and you can't go anywhere else, and it's sort of it's its own world. It's its own microcosm of whatever kind of theme you want to explore.
Hmm.
So, and I'm a real sucker for like, oh, the romantic times in the 1900s, the early 1900s, the Gilded Age and all that. um so yeah, that I think I'm really drawn to that. Um, yeah, it's got everything you need. I mean, when I was uh when the movie came out, I was too old to get swept up in the, oh wow, Titanic or whatever, and I didn't watch it until maybe 10 or 15 years later. And I
What?
watched it. Yeah, and I watched it, I never even saw it. And then I watched it and I was like, this movie's actually amazing. It's got a crazy reputation because of all the teenage girls that were swarming it, watching Leo and all that. But actually, I totally get it now. Like, there's a great story there. So
So,
yeah.
when we say Titanic, are we talking about the actual event or like a narrative version of James Cameron's Titanic?
No, no, no. Narrative version of the actual event. Like,
Okay, good.
I'm acknowledging that James Cameron really captured something about that event in terms of an exciting story. So, kind of like more like hats off to him. I would definitely want to do something different with it, but based on the event, not the movie.
Hmm. So you're what's called a narrative designer, right? So
Yeah.
what actually comes first when you're designing a game? Is it the narrative or the design aspects? Which comes first? Or is it kind of
Well,
like a blending of the two at the same time?
it really depends. I mean, in my career, I can cite examples where I came onto a game that was already, they already had the gameplay. It's a flight game. It's like Rogue Squadron. We want to make a game about X-Wings and snow speeders flying around and shooting things. And then you go, okay, great. What story should we put to it? And so the design comes first. You know what the design of the game is, and then you're putting the narrative on top. Um, with the Telltale games, it was much more of a blurred line of thinking of, going back and forth rapidly between what would we do in this game, then who would we play, what would their story be, and then how would that become a playable, how would the player control that story? What's interesting about that being that person? And then, throwing obstacles in their way in terms of story beats or plot elements. And you sort of going back and forth, but it really depends.
Right. And how many, like say with the Telltale games, how many do-overs of the script would you do? Because I know you're envious of what some people call fast writers, right? Where they can just write really quickly and bang, it's done. Because you do multiple iterations, don't you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, multiple drafts. Yeah, and at Telltale, we would sometimes maybe do too many revisions, but it could be quite a few. It could be quite a few, three or four, because sometimes you'll write the first draft of a scene and you'll sort of stand it up, as we say, and look at it and realize it's a great scene, but there's nothing for the player to do other than watch. So then you kind of have to go back to the drawing board sometimes and think, okay, well, what's interesting from a player standpoint about being in this moment, and then write a scene about that.
Because how many?
That make
Sorry, I was just going to ask how many writers are usually in the writing room at the same time?
on a typical Telltale game, you'd have a writer per episode, say, who was a lead writer, and then they would maybe have 2 or 3 writers who were helping them with various scenes and taking, smaller bits of the story. So it could be 4, and then in the room, as you were planning the whole season, so for Game of Thrones, planning out the whole season, there were maybe 10 of us, maybe 12, sitting in the room, all pitching ideas and trying to figure out the big beats of the story.
But say with Game of Thrones compared to Walking Dead, you had a lot more constraints by HBO, right? So you couldn't go and veer off too far. You have to keep within a certain box somewhat.
Sure. Yeah, it was more like it was like being in a box or just having sort of guardrails on either side. Because we carved out a space for ourselves that was an original family, so we can make up whatever their deal was. But yeah, we could, we were meeting Daenerys and meeting Jon Snow and all these characters that you can't just do whatever you want with them. But in a lot of ways, that reminded me of like writing for Star Wars. It's the same constraints. You want to have Darth Vader in the game, but also anytime Darth Vader's in the game, you can't really do a lot because you can't, he's not up for grabs in terms of, hey, we're going to go on an adventure together. That's not going to happen.
So weren't you the liaison for the brand in terms of like the expanded universe at Star Wars? When you're at
That's right.
LucasArts?
Yeah, for about a year at the end, sort of the end, I was there for 10 years, and at the very last year, I became something known as a content supervisor. And that was a liaison between any of the developers who were making games, both internal to LucasArts, and then there were a few who were external partners. And I was the liaison between them and the ranch was where licensing was. And so they were controlling all the continuity and all that. So I would go between them and I would help them with anything from like, is this story appropriate on a Star Wars level to down to like, how do you spell Wookiee? That kind of thing. So everything and anything that was Star Wars related, I would try to help them out.
So how much of a Star Wars fan were you before you ended up working at LucasArts? Were you
pretty
full
big,
on
yeah.
nerd or
Or
in the middle?
No. I think I was a pretty big nerd. I really loved it as a kid, and I really got into it. And then in the 90s, they put out those Heir to the Empire, the Timothy Zahn novels, and I read those, and I was like, these are pretty cool. And I read the Han Solo novels, and so yeah, I knew quite a bit about it when I got in there. And
I guess that was like the perfect gig for you, somewhat. But even so, the expanded universe is massive.
yeah, it's huge. It was even bigger at the time, right? Like Disney went through and tossed a bunch of it out. But yeah, being at LucasArts as a Star Wars fan was kind of funny because in a weird way, there was a stigma against people who were too much of a fanboy. They were like,
really?
Yeah, they were almost like, calm down a little bit. Like, you know, it could be distracting if you were too much of a fanboy into it and just going around touching every surface like, oh my God, it's all Star Wars. So you had to play it a little bit cool. But that also helped with, I think, bringing in a lot of people who were just bringing in great creative ideas that were outside of the Star Wars universe, so we get a little fresh take on things sometimes. But a lot of us were dyed-in-the-wool nerds and just had to keep it close.
So how long did it take you to work that out? That you need to keep it on the down low a little bit.
Oh, that was pretty quick because I got hired into the test department, and
Right.
the testers were already regarded as, oh, it's the tester. What's he doing here? Like, so you had to really try to present yourself as a calm, rational person and professional, in order to get people over the hump of like who you were and what you did.
Right. Were you one of the ones that got told you were going to be laid off during Republic Commando?
No, I wasn't. No, I had a couple friends that happened to, and ultimately, actually, those layoffs and the departure of my friends caused me to say, I think I'm done here too. And so I left. But yeah, it wasn't too long after that.
Well, I can imagine so, because the morale would have gone down, I suppose,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, it was I mean, Republic Commando was a great game, and everyone knew it was a great game. And they still had to lay off a bunch of those people, and they wanted to start over. And it was like, all we ever wanted to do is make great games, and we did. And now, those people are gone. And a lot of them were like personal friends of mine and people that I found inspiring to work with. And so when those people are gone, not to say there are a lot of people that stayed that I also wanted to work with, but it's just at a certain point, there's always a tipping point, and you feel like, okay, maybe my time here is over too.
Hmm. Well, I will say there is a lot of demand and outrage, I suppose, that there was never a sequel because it ended on a cliffhanger. I posted a little clip of Kevin talking about Republic Commando and then how they got told they were going to get laid off. I posted it on TikTok and it got a massive amount of views, primarily because people are like, "What? That's why there
Yeah,
was no sequel?"
isn't it crazy? It's
Yeah.
crazy. And I remember setting all that stuff up too and talking with the team and be like, okay, we're going to put Sev and he's going to get lost. And, you know, we'll dangle this whole thing and then realizing like, oh, that's probably never going to get resolved.
So do you have to set your basically distance yourself from your own writing so you don't get too attached to it, particularly if it's an idea that you think is going to happen or a story that's going to happen, and then for whatever reason, upper management or something else within the studio causes it to be ripped out of your hands.
Yeah. Yeah. That happens quite frequently too. Like, things change. You have a great idea and it can change because they decide not to do it. It can change because they don't have money to do it. You can pitch this, okay, we're going to blow up something amazing. And they're like, yeah, that's going to cost us $1 million. We can't do that. So figure out a different way to do it. But like, that's game design. I think coming from the game design part of it, game design is also really, really iterative. And you'll have ideas that you'll have in the morning and they get thrown out by the evening. And you just like learn to roll with it because you're all looking for the best version of the idea. And your judge is often the player. You're not allowed to say, really, you can't make an argument like, yeah, but this game design is really awesome if all the players go, yeah, but it's no fun, and then what's the point? So you do have to become pretty flexible about ideas and let things go and just trust that there's going to be a new one coming up tomorrow.
What do you think the hardest part of writing is for you personally?
The hardest part of writing, I think, is the initial idea, like looking for a spark that I can really believe in and that I think is going to set a big enough fire that will keep everyone warm.
Hmm.
Um, that initial spark is really hard to come by. Once the ball gets rolling, I'm pretty good. Like I'm I'm good enough at the craft of writing that I can like keep things going and put a structure in place that works. But like, wow, coming up with that initial thing is tough.
Can you stress yourself out over doing it? Like, oh, I have to come up with this idea, particularly if you've got writer's block. I'm not sure if you do get writer's block.
Oh yeah, all the time. Writer's block is a real thing, and yes, you can stress yourself out, and like, it makes it worse, right? Because you get very anxious about maybe maybe I'll never have another idea in my entire life.
Like
Maybe,
imposter syndrome almost.
yeah, 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 totally. Like
Yeah.
imposter syndrome. Maybe this has all been a big scam up until now that I perpetrated on the world.
Yeah, you've been
Um,
pulling the wool over people's eyes.
yeah. So yeah, that can be very stressful. But I've been lucky to work with people who either pull me out of that or give me enough time to come up with something. So
I think it's quite common though. Um,
yeah,
Eric Walpole, who did a lot of the Valve games like Portal 2 and all that stuff, he goes through the same thing. So,
Oh yeah.
and I know he mentioned it. So,
Yeah,
hmm.
yeah.
One thing I do find interesting is one of your favorite games of all time is Shadow of the Colossus, right? And
Yeah.
it's not
Yeah.
really a narrative driven game. You've kind of got the story at the intro and the outro, and that's it. But I suppose it's more environmental storytelling. So I find it fascinating that's one of your favorite games. But would that partly be because by the end of the day you're just like over dialogue and words? You're like, you know what? I just want to play something that's got no text or no dialogue of any kind. And so
Totally.
yeah.
Yeah, there's a phrase, it's like busman's holiday. Have you ever heard that?
No.
It's like
Can you explain?
the busman's holiday is like going on it's like if you drive a bus all day and then you go on vacation on a bus, you're like you don't want to do that, you know? Um yeah, and I think I have a bit of that in me where I'm like, if I'm writing and thinking about story all day, the kind of game I want is going to take me away from that for a while. And like Shadow of the Colossus is something that is um so visually magnificent and evocative, you know, that I don't need to worry about like what's the story. I just the immersion, you know, that's all I'm looking for. Yeah, and
So
like
I mean, I suppose there's that argument over what's more important, story or gameplay.
a story,
I don't know
obviously.
what the answer is.
No,
Well, you
no, the answer is story. It's obvious to should be obvious to anyone. Should be the highest paid and the most famous of all game designers, the story people.
story people. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, what's Tetris? It could have been huge if only it had a story. Um, yeah, yeah. You know, it's the age old thing. But
Well, it
like,
probably depends on the game as well, I suppose. Right. Yeah. Because some
yeah,
games have a lot of story, some games don't. Sometimes some game developers prioritize story over the gameplay, depending on what they're trying to. I mean, the Telltale games are kind of like interactive novels. That's what they are, really. And
yeah,
I
very much.
suppose story was more front and center, I would think, in that instance.
Absolutely. Yeah. But I mean, it also depends on what you mean by story. Like, story can be theme. And then you could really, you know, like you get a poster of Doom behind you. Like that theme of Doom was like so strong. Um, the world is very, it's much like it's like Shadow of the Colossus. Like it tells a story, even if there are no words to explain what's going on, or even if there are words, it's not that important. But the fact that Doom like has an identifiable world, a tone, a feel, a kind of experience that you're looking for, um, and that there is a progression as you play it, and that's kind of part of the experience. Like to me, that all falls under the the idea of what story does and why we like it as humans. Um, and you know, some people use the word story. What they really mean is like narrative or dialogue. And a narrative is a much more specific part of story, which is like we're going to use language to convey what's happening, or we're going to use language to convey a plot or something like that.
Mm.
Um, but to me, story is a way bigger um, concept, and there's a lot of ways you can express a story.
Yeah. But if you're going to tell a story, do you think it would be harder to do the whole show, not tell sort of thing? So you're doing more environmental storytelling as opposed to via text or dialogue. So like
Yeah, that's
Doom has more environmental storytelling,
more
or at least the
environmentally
original.
have it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you can look at games, older games like Myst, or some of the walking simulator type games, um, that can really convey a lot of stuff through environmental storytelling, or games like What Remains of Edith Finch, which are, you know, great pieces of storytelling that are almost totally experiential. You know,
Mm.
there's not a ton of explanation in terms of dialogue and language.
Yeah.
They don't need it. They don't need it.
Mm. Can you play a game that's very story driven and just separate yourself from it and enjoy it? Or do you end up picking it apart and being like, oh, I would have done this here, I would have done that here. Why
Yeah,
did they use this dialogue or this narrative or this text?
yeah, it's really hard. It's like movies are the same. I'll be sitting in almost every movie and going, um, yeah, okay, I know where we are in the plot. Like I know we're about to hit this beat. We're about to hit, oh, it's the quirky best friend. Okay, I know what's gonna happen here. Yeah, so it makes it really hard. But every once in a while something will come along that's like really, really good or immersive, like Red Dead 2. I just got lost in it. After, at some point I just give up. I'm like, okay, I give up. I give over to the narrative. I'm going with you, wherever you're going. Um, and I don't know if you've seen the Godzilla -1.
No, I haven't seen it yet, but I've heard
Pretty
nothing but
good.
good things.
Yeah, so and I think honestly, I'll say I think it lives up to the hype. It's one of the few movies in the last like maybe 5 years that I really was like, I'm blown away by what they're doing. It was
Hmm.
totally unexpected and pulled off really well.
What's
So
your thought on ChatGPT then and AI and how it's being used for writing? I mean, obviously you've had all these strikes recently in Hollywood in regards to writing, but what's have you mucked around with that sort of thing just to test it out? What are your thoughts on it?
yeah,
The
yeah,
good, the
yeah.
bad, the ugly?
Yeah, I messed around with ChatGPT quite a bit, trying to figure out what it does well and if it's useful for writing. And I've messed around with visual, versions of that, like Mid Journey and Dolly, on the visual side to see what they're good at. Obviously, they're evolving. The thing that the thing that ChatGPT cannot help me with is exactly what you asked about before, which is like I need a spark, and I need that spark to be original and personal. Um, because if it's generic, then there's nothing to build on. And the problem with Chat GPT as a tool for me personally as a writer is like it's really good at taking everything else that's been done and synthesizing it, and spitting it back out at you. But it's like making sausage. People like sausage, so there's nothing wrong with that. I have it on my pizza, but like as a creative tool, it's tough to work with. Generally, what I find with ChatGPT is that even like if I've asked it to say, okay, develop me a character who's got these personality traits, and it'll give me something back. And that thing is generally unusable, not because it's like gobbledygook, like it's intelligible, but it's just it's kind of like applesauce. It's like, okay, there's nothing really here. I mean, yeah, it's edible, but like, I don't know. So we'll see if it, I don't know what it'll take to get it to a point where it has the weird personal quirks that human writers have, which makes us interested in their work. Because at that point, it'll just be basically human. So then we're back to the original problem, which is like working with other people is tough.
Yeah, and it's still in its infancy, really, when you
Yeah.
consider how long it's been around. So it will continue to evolve. I mean, I find
Yeah.
it's good maybe for an initial template, but it can't do anything specific. The specificity is not there, particularly when you get
Yeah.
into the real nitty gritty. Yeah, which
Exactly.
writers
Like,
need to do, right? You need to get down into the detail.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the detail and the specificity is what makes one idea better than another. Um, it's why I'm never really that shy about sharing my plots that I'm working on. Like people are like, "Oh, what's your next book about?" And I'll tell them what the plot is because I'm like, anyone can come up with these dumb plots. It's really about that execution or bringing something really personal to it. That's the difference between what I write and what someone else writes. So, you see that all the time in Hollywood with like different directors will have a take on a film, and one of them really gets it and one of them doesn't. But it's the same, it's kind of like the same story, like when they do a remake. Um, so yeah, I feel like Chat GPT, like you say, like it can provide a template, but what use is that template if you can't then, as the human part of it, bring something personal to it?
Do you think the writing has gotten better in film, personally, or gotten worse?
No, I think it's got much worse. Much worse. Yeah.
It's very rare that I watch a film now and the narrative or the dialogue really impacts me.
Yeah.
Um, I watched Oppenheimer and I had to have subtitles on because I was, because of quantum mechanics and I didn't know what the heck it was, so that was probably about the one that's probably most impactful just because it was talking about something that I know very little about. But I'm sure. I mean, do you watch films with subtitles on or no?
Oh, totally. I watch subtitles all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
I,
yeah.
I like I have that weird thing where I'm like, I can hear fine, but for some reason I cannot hear what words people are saying in movies. I don't know what it is. So yeah, I'm always like watching with the subtitles on.
Mm. Do you have one story that you've written for a game, one narrative that you're like, this is my masterpiece. This is the best work I've done. Or are you always looking at it and critiquing it?
Oh God, yeah, no, absolutely. I'm nowhere near a masterpiece when it comes to that. Yeah, no. All my games, I'm like, oh gosh, I wish I could have done better with that one.
Well, what's that saying? You never finish a project, you abandon it, right?
Yeah,
Somebody in the suits comes along and is like, "You're done here," and takes it
yep.
away.
And
Yep.
gonna move on to the next thing.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah, yep.
And you just look back and go, what was I thinking? Yeah.
I heard this. I don't know if it's true, so I want you to confirm. Is it true that you made a pitch to the owners of, well, the rights owners of the James Bond IP to do a James Bond narrative where James Bond was an African American or a female?
No, 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 I never made that pitch. And I wanted to at Telltale at one point, the Bond people were like, hey, pitch us a game idea. Um, but my idea was not an African American, but like a Pakistani or somebody from the empire who maybe Indian or whatever, who like represented that part of the empire. But also I thought it would be interesting to say like, oh, like as a person of color in the empire and as a former colony, all that stuff would come up, right? So what kind of bond would that be? And I thought they'll never go for it ever.
Wow.
That's way too far out there for a bond. I think it might even just violate the fantasy altogether. But like that was the one idea that I would have wanted to explore with a bond game.
I have no idea what the response would have been to that. It
I
probably
don't
would
know.
have, it probably would have been controversial, to be honest.
Yeah, it might have been too controversial to like support a Bond game. Like it would have overwhelmed whatever Bond story we were trying to tell. So I never pitched that one for that reason, because I was like, they'll never go for it. And even if they did go for it, it might just be too crazy.
So it was merely just an idea in the back of your mind. Did you actually write anything down?
It was an
Or were you
idea that
writing it and then you're like, no, 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 I'm not doing this?
yeah, it was like one of those ideas where I was walking around telling everybody about it, but I had no intention of actually pitching it. Like I wanted the credit for, you know, having a crazy idea, but I didn't. I knew no one would do it. So yeah, it was one of those. Yeah, there's been a lot of those where you just walk around telling someone, "Oh, I got my crazy idea about this game," and then we'll never make it.
Are people of support? Are people supportive of that idea when you tell them these things, or are they like, "What are you thinking?"
Yeah. Yeah. I think it was a mixture of both. It was like, that's great, Ryan. What are you thinking? Yeah, it was definitely a look of confusion a lot of times. Like, what? That's it. Okay.
What was your favorite game to work on at Telltale?
Favorite game to work on.
Come on, there must be one, surely.
I know they were all really
Or
fun.
or they all
They
your
were,
babies, sort of thing. You all love them equally.
no, some of them, but but you don't tell your children that. It breaks their hearts.
Of course.
No, but what you're making me think of right now is more like what was the experience of working on them like? And that was generally, I mean, it was hard, but I often work with people who I really liked and we had fun making it, even if it was a really tough game or didn't come out the way we wanted. Even so, I have memories of like, fun moments in the room and coming up with stuff that was really cool. Um, and even just going out to lunch and commiserating about like this game is breaking my back. Um, so yeah, it's hard to parse out which one was my favorite. I think in terms of the final product, I like to replay Wolf Among Us, which I can't say about a lot of the other games, like either because the subject matter didn't interest me or because like one playthrough was kind of like my head canon. But I'm always drawn to like, I want to like play Wolf a little bit again, or at least look at it. I think it's a beautiful game to look at.
I had to commend you guys at Telltale because it felt like those games were like a television set. You're just banging them out, right? It's like a cog in the machine. You're just going, going. Did you ever get to stop, or was it like a machine that just kept going? And I imagine the
Yeah.
hours were crazy.
Yeah, the hours were crazy. It was a treadmill to just keep cranking things out, and that really was tough on a lot of people. Um, and there was a lot of burnout, but
Yeah.
but the way that those games were constructed was quite brilliant, in that you could make a lot of them and repeat them over and over, and um, reusing techniques and reusing animations really helped us do that. And keeping the ambition low too in terms of the gameplay. It was always frustrating to me as a designer that we weren't able to really branch off and let's make an open world game. That was never going to happen. But it also kept us on the on the not on the treadmill, but on the ability to like keep making new stuff. Like if we wanted to make a Batman game, we could add that to the list, and just keep rolling with it.
Hmm. Did you direct all the voice actors as well, or
Not
did
all of
somebody else
them.
handle that?
Yeah, that was a shared responsibility among a lot of people. I was lucky to be in a couple of sessions, and I really loved doing that. But it really depended on who was working on what and who had the time that day, because those voice sessions could be over several weeks and multiple sessions, and maybe someone would direct one, and then you come in and direct the next one, and then so on and so on.
I actually think that's a good way of doing it, so it doesn't get too monotonous. Standing in one room, with a voice actor and just directing them on how to say lines. Yeah.
Yeah. And it takes time out of your creative day. So a typical voice session would be like 4 hours. So you go to the
Wow.
studio, um, and then you're kind of locked into that a dark room for 4 hours, and you really can't communicate with the outside too much. Um, and so by the time you came back to the office, a whole bunch of maybe other things had piled up on your desk, and you had to find time to do that. So it can be really time consuming. And then yeah, you just couldn't do a lot else if you were voice directing a session.
Was there ever a take? Sorry,
What's that?
you keep going. I was going to ask. Was there ever a take that just took so long to do? Just the repeating of one line over and over and over again.
We tried not to do that. We had I was gonna say actually we had great partners in this company called Bay Area Sound Design. Um, and those guys, Julian Kwasniewski and Jared Emerson Johnson, and Jory Prom, like they were they were like outside Telltale, but they were basically a Telltale team. They knew us really well. And they would do a lot of the voice directing too, either when we couldn't, or um, they would take over. Say maybe a line wasn't going well, like in your example, they would often have great ideas for how to change it up, or like, hey, let me direct it a different way, or something that would get the result. Um, but some of the worst sessions were like, we had a couple where we had cast an actor and we were having a session with them, and then we realized like this is not the right person. I mean, you'd be 3 hours into it and you're like, maybe he just needs to warm up, or maybe she doesn't get it. And you're like at hour 3 or 4 and you're all looking at each other, and they can sense it too. It's a terrible moment. And you're like, this is not working. We need a recast. and you've plugged in 4 hours of time, and yeah, that didn't happen too often, but it happened enough, and it's always traumatic when it does.
It sounds awkward as well because you have to be to the
So
actor.
awkward.
Sorry, 3 hours,
Yep.
but
Yeah.
you're miscast. Sorry.
Yeah.
Have
It
a good
was bad.
one. You know.
I know. And they'd be excited because they wanted to, they were going to be in the game, and then we have to kind of come back to them later and go, oh, it just didn't work. I'm sorry. But most of them were professional VO actors, so that's part of the biz, and they get it. And the more professional they are about handling that situation, the more likely they might get called back next time, for something else. So, um, yeah, but yes, very awkward. Nobody likes that, but yeah.
What do you think is your biggest strength and weakness as a writer? Out of curiosity.
Strengths and weakness. I
This is
don't
like a
know.
job interview.
I know. I know. I'm interviewing for a job
After
right
I
now.
asked it, I was like, "Oh, this is like a job interview." I'm just curious.
I thought I already had the job. I know. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess my strength it would be I'm good at figuring out what the emotional core of a scene or a story is, especially if, someone's already kind of developed it. I'm a good editor when I can come in and say, let's get to the emotional part of this, or tell me what the story is really about. I just posted this thing on LinkedIn that was like a YouTube breakdown of Jurassic Park, the original Jurassic Park, by this guy named Mike Hill, and he did a brilliant examination of like the story beneath the story. Basically saying, you think this story is about dinosaurs? It's not. It's actually about a family and how to form a family, and he goes through and he highlights where those emotional beats are happening, and how we respond as people to that way more than we do about like dinosaur DNA or action beats or whatever. So that's the kind of thing I'm drawn to. But like my weakness would definitely be just I struggle. Honestly, I struggle with dialogue. Dialogue is something I'm constantly second guessing. I'm like, does this sound real? Would people really say this? Why are they saying this? So I can get really in my head about just straight up dialogue. Um, yeah, which is ironic because I've written so much dialogue, but maybe that's the reason I hate it so much.
Would you sound out? So would you write it and then try and say it as a way to see if it sounds like something someone would say?
Yeah, but like also I'll second guess myself because I'm a terrible actor. So even if I had a good line, I'm like, this might be a good line that I'm just saying like an idiot, because I'm a terrible actor, like, but it could be a good line.
But if you second guess yourself, I mean, I'm trying to put myself in your shoes here. I might get someone else to say the line to see if it is reflected well. Have you
Sure,
ever done
yeah.
that?
We give it to somebody else to read too. Yeah, just to
Yeah.
say like, am I crazy? Does this make any sense at all? Um, so yeah, I absolutely need proofreaders and editors and feedback and people to tell me if I'm smoking crack.
Do you read the dictionary a lot or a thesaurus or something just to try and get new words somewhere in the back of your mind that you can use?
I did actually when I began to write the novel, because writing a novel and writing in that way is so different than just writing kind of game dialogue. We don't use that many words when we speak, so our available uh, language is pretty small when we're speaking to each other. But like when you write in a novel, you're trying to evoke things that need more specific words, more um, can be, evocative words, poetic words, whatever. So I actually like went out and bought like a thick thesaurus just so I would flip through it and see other words and kind of put those in my brain as I was going through it. But that was new. That was a muscle I hadn't flexed in a really long time. Just writing game dialogue is totally different than writing novel.
Oh, it would be, right? And you've mentioned in an article you wrote about, oh, it might have been an article or was it a tweet maybe, where you're talking about this trick that you do in regards to the whole third person and first person thing, right? So if something isn't working in third person, you write it in first person to try and get a different view of what you're writing and what you're trying to convey. And it
I wrote
worked.
that. I wrote that. Did I?
Yeah,
That
you
sounds
wrote.
really smart. That sounds really smart. I should try that. I completely forgot I wrote that.
Yeah, you wrote it somewhere. I'll find the quote
I
because I was
believe you. It's
like, oh, that's brilliant.
I think that's part of my problem is I will come up with techniques like that
And then
and
you forget
use
your
them
own
for a while,
techniques.
totally forget, yeah, what I was doing. Yeah, the worst.
That's hilarious. Well, I'll have to find the quote and send it back to you because I read it and I was like, oh,
Yeah.
that's actually very, very smart. So I was going to ask about how'd you come up with the technique, but you probably don't even remember.
I don't. I could make something up for you though right now, just for the podcast, and just say, it was yes, it was taught to me by Ernest Hemingway. We were in Paris. Um, yeah, I mean, I now that I'm thinking about it, I have done that, especially in the novel. Like, if I'm unsatisfied with the passage, I'll flip it and write it in first person and think, okay, is that better? Is it more immediate? Is that what was missing? You know, was I too detached? Is third person too detached? Um, to try and get closer. And there are parts in the novel that switched to first person because I was like, it just works better that way. But yeah, God, maybe that's what I was talking about. That's definitely what I was talking about.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we'll go with
that's
that.
it.
We'll go with that.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. I've seen in one of your articles that you use a whiteboard, right? Is that just for the initial idea to try and work out how the story beats are going to go? Is that what it's
Yeah.
primarily used for?
Yeah. I'm super visual when it comes to stuff like that. Like when it comes to structure. So I need like Post-its and note cards and that kind of thing that I can like grab and move around and reorder and then step back and look at the whole structure. Um, we really started doing that at Telltale and it was massively helpful and it's something I still do. Um, to work out beats of a story, you know, like what happens here and what does the first act look like? And do we have an action beat? Do we have an emotional beat? Do we have this kind of thing? And we would use different colored cards to represent different moments. Like an action beat would be in blue, an emotional beat would be in green. There'd be a choice moment, maybe that's pink. And so once you lay those all out, you can literally step back, 10 feet. You can't read the words anymore, but now you can just you can almost look at the pacing and go, okay, wow, we have a lot of talking in the first act. Like I see a lot of dialogue scenes there. I don't know what they're about, but I can just see there's a lot of dialogue and maybe we need to move an action beat in there. Um, and it's interesting because I once went on a tour of Pixar, and in Pixar in the lobby they have uh colored storyboards, mood boards of the entire film. So they'll lay out like Wall-E in these really small little storyboards that have color. And what you end up seeing is the color of the movie shifts over time and it corresponds to the story beats that they're trying to get at, So if it's an action scene or something, you'll see it like shifting into like hotter colors. Maybe it's red, and then you'll see it like cooling down and going back to sort of maybe they're more blues and greens. Um, and not that we're doing the same thing, but it was a way, those little note cards and using a whiteboard and that was like a way for me to look almost with unfocused eyes at like the musicality of the story. Like, is it rising and falling the way I want it to? And do I have all like my markers in the right places? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. Though I'm wondering if it would work on in every instance because Wall-E's kind of an anomaly, isn't it? It's not really a story-driven film. It's very environmental. Like there's hardly any dialogue really in it. Yeah. So
Yeah,
I'm wondering if it just worked for that project or if that's a template that they use
yeah,
in all the films.
I'm not 100% sure how they use that, but they had a couple of different examples, and I can't recall the exact films, but there was more than one, and I was just really struck by just the fact that they would have paid that much attention to it, which of course they're Pixar, they're professionals. But I was like, this is really interesting to reveal that there's a structure to the movie, a color structure to the movie that relates to the pacing somehow. And I hadn't even noticed. It's not something you could see if you watched it.
Yeah. Were there any games or IP that you wanted to work with at Telltale that you didn't get to? Obviously, James Bond being one, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Titanic being the other one.
Titanic. Yeah.
I loved the Hellboy license. I don't
Yes,
know if
I know
you've
you're
seen
a
the
fan.
Hellboy license. Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
a big fan of Hellboy. And I always wanted to do something, and I thought Telltale would have been a great place to do a Hellboy game. Um, but that never happened. I don't think the license was quite big enough, but I would have loved to do something like that.
How much does it cost in terms of budget if you have to change narrative after everything's already been implemented, right? Let's say everything gets approved and then you do a rough cut of a cutscene with dialogue or an interactive cutscene, I should say, and you guys are all looking at it and you're like, yeah, this isn't working. We need to change something here. And, the voices have already been recorded. Everything's kind of already there or a rough
Yeah.
cut. And then you take it out. I mean, that must push back things quite a bit. It's not as simple as just changing a gameplay mechanic, right? Because the narrative, everything's already there.
Yeah. It can be expensive, but it can also be weirdly cheap if depending on what happens. So maybe there's two circumstances on either end. So the first one is like a page one rewrite where you go, the scene's bad, it's not working. We actually don't even want these characters to be in this place anymore. We're going to move them somewhere else, and it might even be a different cast of people in this scene for whatever reason. So you're basically just hitting the big plunger and everything blows up. And it's like you say, you're starting completely from scratch. That's expensive. What's less expensive as you move toward the other end is like it could be the same people in the same room with the same clothes and the same lighting, and maybe there's been some of the same animations. Say they're talking, they're sitting at a table talking, and all you're doing is changing what they're saying. And like, yeah, you have to pay for new writing and new VO, but you don't have to pay to have new characters modeled. You don't have to pay for new animations. You don't have to pay for new set because that one still works. So like, it really depends. And sometimes I think the problem with Telltale was that people did see that rewrites were somewhat cheap because it's like, oh, just rewrite it, but put it in the same room, or maybe there's some dialogue you can redo. And that seemed, I think, cheap enough to pull the trigger on. But like, of course, it's still time, it's still effort, and it's creatively, um, it can be creatively uh harmful, to people to just have their work rewritten over and over. Even if they're the ones doing it, they just might be like, I cannot write another version of this scene. I can't do it.
But what about
So you
the
have to
lip
be
syncing
careful.
as well?
Lip syncing was sometimes automatically done. And so that might even,
Ah.
yeah, like there were the features that would scan the phonemes in the VO file and then basically translate those to phonemes that like lip flap. So it wasn't always you didn't have to like go in there and do the lip sync yourself.
So I wonder if that happens during localization as well with let's say a Japanese game, right? And then it goes to the West for dialogue there. If they apply that, I don't know. Or if they just
Yeah,
keep
I
it
don't
as
know
is.
either. Yeah, sometimes like you'll get I know you'll get localization trying their best to create a line that fits the same length. Because like sometimes languages like German can be quite a bit longer, like the sentences or the words, and they'll really have to bend over backwards to create something that's like roughly the same length as the English line, whether that's a piece of dialogue on screen or, an actual VLOG line. I know that they have to deal with trying to keep within certain parameters.
Hmm. Did you ever deal with any localization in terms of dialogue being translated with any games that you've
Yeah,
worked on?
yeah. In most of them, I think actually is. you obviously I'm not doing it myself, but I would
Yeah,
like
yeah.
notes from the localization team, and it would usually be something along the lines of like, what is this joke? Like, can you explain this joke to the German team so that they can create a joke that is similar in German, you know? So you have to like explain a joke like, why is this funny in English and how would you make it funny in German? Um, or yeah, there were other little instances where you were like reviewing, I don't know, something that they'd done and going, oh, actually, that's like not what we meant at all. So that didn't happen too often. I think most of the localization teams are pretty dang good.
That must inflate a budget quite a bit, though, if you're having to do a lot of translations, right? Let's say you take a Telltale game and it has to be translated in German and Japanese and French. And I mean, in the EU alone, there's like so many languages, right? So,
Yeah, they used to call it e-figs. English, French, Italian, German, and Spanish. Those were the big languages that it would be localized into. And yeah, it adds a bit, but the idea is then that you recoup that cost by selling, you know, someone in France is buying the game in their own because they're like, oh, hey, it's in French. I would like to play that. So yeah, there's an upfront cost.
do you play Japanese games with the English dialogue, or do you keep it on, say, the Japanese dialogue?
Oh gosh, there was just one. It's not a Japanese game, but it was Ghost of Tsushima, which they released Ghost of Tsushima with like a Japanese soundtrack, and I was like all in on that. I'm like, yes, please, because I love like the source material was those Kurosawa movies, and like I love Kurosawa, and yeah, they don't do dubs of his films, so you watch it in Japanese with subtitles, and I was like, yeah, I'm gonna play Ghost of Tsushima with Japanese language and subtitles on.
Hmm. Because I find when Japanese games get translated in English, usually the dialogue is a bit rough, or the voice acting's rough, and it doesn't sound good compared to the Japanese dub. And I'm always wondering
Yeah,
why that is. That the translation is somehow they're never able to get it right. It seems doesn't matter what it
I've heard,
is.
yeah, I've heard someone try to explain that, and they were saying, and they were a Japanese speaker, and they were saying like, again, there are things that you can say in Japanese in a certain way that just like sound silly when you say them in English, but like in Japanese, like there's a context for it that makes it like, oh, okay, I get like why this is the way it is. Almost like, you know how cowboys talk in cowboy movies and they're like, all right, this town ain't big enough for the two of us, you know. Like nobody talks like that, you know. And if you try to translate that into God, I have no idea what that would be like in like German. How's it, you know, how are you going to convey
Yeah,
that same feeling or the context around it? They were kind of trying to make that point. So I'm like, okay, I sort of get that.
yeah. I wonder what, let's say, with like the Final Fantasy games, right? Because they're heavy dialogue driven, and
Yeah.
the translation must be a nightmare.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know
Yeah,
how they do that. And sometimes you'll get one that I am like that is sort of head and shoulders above the rest, you know? Like I'll see a Japanese game every once in a while. It comes over and off like the dub, not the dub, but like the translation is really good. And you notice it. You're like, oh, okay, this is pretty good actually, and it makes sense. And someone's taken some time to do this right.
yeah. I mean, I haven't played, say, the Rockstar games in another language, so I don't even, because those games are so massive. I mean, GTA 6, for example, I I don't even want
Yeah,
to
what was that?
comprehend. Yeah, yeah, how many voice actors will be involved on
Oh
and the
my God.
translation. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Would you ever want to work on something like that? Like a big, massive open world AAA game. I mean, I know you loved Red Dead Redemption 2, and I know you like GTA as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be a blast. I
Yeah.
mean, at least
Probably
I think
overwhelming as well,
it
but
probably would
yeah,
be. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, those teams are so huge and those games take so long. It would be kind of, I think that would be a bit much, but like being part of it, oh, that would be amazing.
Yeah. Well, hey, I will wrap up there. But before we go, we do have to give a little plug for your novel. So why don't you
Oh, yeah.
tell everyone about it, where they can get it, what it's about?
All right, yeah. So let's do a plug for the novel. It's something I've written and released earlier this year. It's called Gawain: A Year to Live, and it is a retelling of the Sir Gawain and the Green Knight poem, which is from the 14th century. But I've updated it, and I took the story and expanded on it a lot. And there's a twist to the character that's brand new that isn't in the poem, and it's something that I think people will find really interesting and thought-provoking. And plus, there's a lot of humor in there if you like Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. There's a lot of just there's cheeky dragons with funny things to say, and there's action and adventure knights fighting each other. But there's also kind of thought-provoking stuff. So grab it. It's on Amazon. Go out and get it. It's pretty cheap on Kindle, and you can pick it up for like $2. Or get the paperback. Why not?
Why not? How long did it take you to write, just out of curiosity?
About 2 years. And there was a draft of it that was fairly far along, and I took it and threw it in the bin. And I was like, we're starting over. Yeah. So it's a passion project. It's a labor of love. But yeah, I think it got a lot better when I did that.
How far along were you when you threw it in the bin?
I'd say about 2/3 of the way through.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Power to you.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
but
But it
go
came
out and
out.
check it out. Yeah.
It came out
See
right.
what
So
the product is like. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So if anyone wants to keep up to date with what you're doing, where can they follow you to do that?
I'm on Twitter at Mr. Fox, and I think I have my link tree there, which has my Instagram as well. I think I'm also Mr. Fox on Instagram. Yeah, for all my latest doings, whatever those may be.
I'm sure there's more to come.
Yeah.
The best of your career is still to come.
Yes, I hope
Yes.
so. Yes, I've just taken a new position at a game studio called Probably Monsters, and we're going to be doing, I can't say much about it, but single player narrative games. I'll just say that much.
Nice. That's vague enough to give people an idea, but nothing else.
Yeah, that's all I can say.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, that is the show, everyone. Make sure you share, like, and subscribe. And until next time, stay safe.